Well, thank you very much for staying with us on the AM show. And we have quite a lot coming for you, especially when we talk about graft corruption. In our first big story, the latest Afro-barometer report from the CDD indicates the presidency is the second most corrupt institution, next only to the Ghana Police Service. Again, Akakpo's performance has been adjudged the worst in the last 20 years. Is this reality? Our panelists will shed light on this damning report. We'll also be getting into the matter of the family of the late President Evans Atta Mills as the family heads to court to stop the operations of the Atta Mills Institute. And don't you forget, we're asking you this morning, when you look at the fight against corruption and what has recently been released in respect of the presidency, is that a perception that you feel is the reality? We ask those questions. But let's start with a conversation on corruption. And joining me in the studio, even before we introduce our guests, Bernice, Abu-Baidoo, Lansah. Bernice, good morning.
Good morning to you. Good morning to you. How are you doing?
I'm well. It's one of those mornings. I
know, right? So we have quite a lot of documents to source when it comes to the issue of corruption. Quite recently, there have been a couple released, but the latest is the round 9 survey of the Afrobarometer report. And
and just to chip in, these reports have been coming back to back. We just had
the UNODC
from, the Global Info Analytics first, shortly after the UNODC, and now this one. And they all seem to be pointing in a certain very unhealthy direction.
Yeah. So let's just give you details of that particular survey so that we can zoom into our conversation. So there were a couple of questions the Afrobarometer sought to get answers to, and people were sampled from different parts of the region, the different parts of the country. What I like about the methodology, though, is that this time around you have 50% men, 50% women.
Right.
And so there's a bit of gender balance there. But let's focus on this particular finding. So the question is, there are many ways to govern a country. Would you disapprove or approve of the following alternatives? Only one political party is allowed to stand for election and hold office. The army comes in to govern the country. Elections and parliament are abolished so that the president can decide everything. So these were the questions that people had to give answers to. And let's see what the findings are. Right. So 89% of respondents rejected the one-party rule. 88% rejected one-man rule. 67% rejected military rule. And 76% prefer democracy. For me, the interesting point here is that, so what happened to the rest of that 76%?
So
what do
24%.
What do they prefer?
Well, it could be anything in between. These, it doesn't state whether or not there were some people who chose not to respond, to sit on the fence. But one pattern is clear, especially from after the post-independence period, what had happened with Nkrumah and all of that. You can see that people are definitely against one-party rule, and especially, as well, one-man rule. So that is clear. What I find surprising, Bernice, is the rejection of military rule. Because if you look at that, the number is not what, the percentage is not what I would have expected. I would have expected it to be pretty high, but it's just 67%.
And it's also
that leaves some 33% who actually would probably go for military rule.
Yeah, so that's problematic, and we'll be bringing you more on this as we delve deeper into the Afro-barometer report, and we'll quickly move to our next slide. Right, so this is support for democratic norms or institutions. And I like this because what the CDD has done is to paint a picture from 2002 to 2022,
right.
Okay?
A span of 20 years.
Yes, so you have it here, 57%. Okay, you know what, let's interpret the colors first, then we can come and do the analysis. So if you see the mauve color, it supports multi-party competition. Blue supports presidential term limit. Turquoise, prefer accountable governance. And orange, support elections as a best way to choose leaders. So when you come to 2002, 57% support multi-party competition, 77% prefer accountable
governance.
No, there's no 77. So that started from 2012. Sorry, this the 77% color confused me. Sorry. So the blue support presidential term limit, 77%, and 89% support elections as the best way to choose leaders. But you see, it rises in 2012, dips in 2014 to 2017, and then it has a steady rise again until 2022, where 84% support that elections are the best way to choose our leaders. It hasn't gone back to as high as it was in 2002. Now, when it comes to supporting presidential term limit, you see once again that there's an upward trend from 2008 to 2012. There's a dip till 2017, and then it begins to go up again until 2022, where we have 76% supporting a presidential term limit. Now, when it comes to the turquoise, preferring accountable governance. So you see, that's on an upward trend. Right from when that was included in 2012, it just goes up, 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 up. We have our guest on Zoom, but I think it's important for us to set the foundation right so that we can have a good conversation. We've got Dr. Osai Kwapong, we've got Dr. Karibu Mohammed, Dr. Karibu Mohammed, who is a technical advisor at the Office of the Vice President, also joining us. Professor Bafo Ajimandua is CEO of the Kufuor Foundation. He will also be sharing his thoughts with us. But let's just do a couple more. And let me acknowledge our guests. Thank you so much for joining the program. We just want to share a bit more details with our audience, and then we can zoom into the conversation. So we move on to our next slide. Right. So support for political party turnover. In 2002. Now, it is better if power sometimes changes hands in elections from one political party to the other. 53% agree very strongly and 16% agree. Now, it doesn't matter if one party always wins and continuously governs the country. So, Benjamin, look what's happening here. 19% agree strongly and 11% agree. So the issue of one party staying in power is also played on here. So we'll do.
There's a breakdown of the 21%.
Yeah. So we'll do the next one, and then
30%.
We'll have our guests join us. Right. So demand for representation of elected officials. Respondents were asked, which of the following statements is closest to your view? Statement 1, our elected officials should listen to voters' views and do what they demand. Statement 2, our elected leaders should follow their own ideas in deciding what is best for the country. Now, 70% agree very strongly when it comes to statement 1. Elected officials should listen to voters' views. And 19% agree. When it comes to elected leaders following their own ideas, 5% agree very strongly and 5% agree. So we'll hold on here, but we'll be bringing you more details from that report as and when it demands in our conversation with our guests. Benjamin.
Well, let's start with our guests. We have Professor Bafo Ajimandua. We have Dr. Mahama from the Office of the Vice President joining the conversation. And we also have joining the conversation Dr. Osai Kwapong. Dr. Kwapong, a very good morning to you. In fact, gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you.
Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Right.
Good morning.
Let me start with you, Dr. Osai Kwapong. So this is the latest in a string of reports that we've seen, and there's a whole lot to look at in terms of governance, in terms of corruption, in terms of leadership, and in terms of the presidency, most of all. But when you look at this latest sampling by the Afrobarometer from the different regions that were sampled and the numbers involved, I would ask all of you for your general appreciation of what this survey shows or demonstrates before we get into the nitty-gritty. I'll start with you, Dr. Kwapong.
Yes, so thank you again. I mean, my general impression, and I was part of the CDD panel reflecting on this yesterday when it was publicly released. And you're starting to realize that we do face some serious challenges with regards to our attempts to promote and ensure good governance within our democratic polity. I was at least happy that, as I've been arguing for some time now, that we've made our peace with democracy. I liked the fact that support for democracy remains generally high. I also like the fact that we have very positive attitudes towards various democratic norms. We want to choose our leaders through elections. We support accountable governance. We believe in party turnover. We believe in multi-partyism. We reject authoritarian forms of government. So that, for me, was reassuring that at least we really do embrace this thing that we call, this form of government that we call democracy. But again, you do also see in other parts of the report that whilst we've made our peace with democracy, this democracy is also facing some major challenges that we would need to address going forward.
Right. Let me come to Prof as well. Prof, what would be your fundamental appreciation of this latest survey?
Well, thank you, and good morning from the beautiful Kumasi, where I am right now.
Prof, you would have to speak up a bit for me. I can barely hear you.
Yes, this report really doesn't surprise me much, because if you look at the trends over the years, if you go back to the late 90s when Afro-barometer began its work, through the 2000s and all the way to today, you can see a very, very interesting trend here. First of all, as my very good friend just said, the support for democracy certainly is quite strong. But the practice of democracy has become the real challenge. So clearly, Ghanaians are not necessarily in democracy, but in democratic practice, how our politicians are running the show. And I think that is the basic issue that I give to this report. And as we go along, maybe some details will be provided. But certainly, there's a crisis of trust and confidence in how our politicians have been practicing democracy as we should, as we know it. And I think this is a real challenge for us.
Let me come to you, Dr. Mahama. I know you're very concerned about methodology, usually when these reports come out. And I would walk you through the methodology. I know you've seen it already of this entire enterprise. We know that it was nationally representative from all the regions of the country. All respondents were randomly selected, so it feeds into the random selection process. Samples were distributed across regions, states, provinces, urban and rural. We also know that every adult citizen had an equal chance of being selected. Then face-to-face interviews, standard questionnaire, a sample size of 2,400 with a confidence level of 95% plus or minus 2. And of course, that feeds into the latest round of Afro-barometer investigations. It was also a perfect pairing of men versus women, 50% apiece. And in terms of religion, 78% were Christian, 16% Muslim, and others 6%. But let's look at what your fundamental views are of this latest research. Hello, Dr. Mahama.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Please go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much. Good morning to you and then to Prof. and then Dr. Osai Popon. I must say that, I mean, the repetition or the pedigree of Afro-barometer when it comes to these things goes back to the 1999, 2000, as mentioned by Prof. This particular pedigree is something that I don't probably sit here to question. However, as you mentioned, I had a bit about, concern about the representation, because your uncle mentioned that, she was happy that we have 50-50 representation. If you look at it on the face of that, you realize that it is not balanced, because the population of Ghana is not 50-50. That is one. Second,
But Dr. Mahama, the population of Ghana in terms of women versus men is just slightly skewed in terms of the women being more than the men, even per the latest statistics from the Ghana Statistical Service.
I'm raising this point because the methodology has stated that they are using the 2,400 sample was distributed proportionally according to gender, according to locality, and according to regions. So if it is distributed proportionally, we will expect that there is some slight differences. That's the one point. Secondly, there is also an issue about locality. As much as 60% of the respondents are coming from urban area. Even though we are having a trajectory where the population is gradually becoming urban or urbanized, we don't still have as much as 60% of the country population being in urban area. Of course, we are talking about adult population, basically between 15 to 64. But for the purposes of maybe a survey like this, they may be looking at 18, where people have the right to vote and to probably express opinion on the governance issue of this particular country. Looking at that, I mean, I feel like there's a bit of an issue. That might not take away the substantive fact, but I'm just raising this issue to the point that, look, minor differences in figures can account for substantial differences in opinion. So that is the point.
You're suggesting, Dr. Mahama, that these slight distinctions or distortions, if you like, I mean, our population, I can look for the facts and figures, but I know it's just slightly over 50% for women in terms of the population and a little under that for the men. And these regional categorizations and others that you refer to, yes, I agree. Some small factors in statistical analyses can create some distortions, but you're saying that these slight differences could account for some of the results we are seeing?
I'm saying that, yes, it could account for the results. That is not, again, to say that I am treating this result with contempt. That is not the suggestion I'm making. Let's
look at this. From a certain standpoint, do you accept the results of this survey? Let me put it that way, rather. Do you accept?
Oh, I mean, largely, I think that the result comes closer to what people or what I expect as an objective stamp by what I see or what I think that research findings should expose. So largely, the result shows that, I mean, of course, it's an opinion survey. So, and the opinion of Ghanaians, for that matter, is very much consistent with what I hear every day on the street of Mankola, on the street of Malata. So it is very much something that I would not want to say that it is out of the ordinary. It is a result that I will accept as a basis to work with.
All right. We'll get into substantive matters with you. I just wanted to, create the bedrock for the conversation. I'll let Bernice, my colleague, come in. But before that, since Dr. Akakpo, you were actually involved in a way at the launch of this and all of that, I would like to know whether you corroborate what Dr. Mahama is saying. Do you agree with his sentiments about the distortions?
So it's not necessarily a distortion, as in, yes, he does point out that the 50-50 male to female breakdown is also because of the sampling methodology, right? That whilst everyone is randomly selected, what the Afrobarometer approach also does is that they alternate, right? So that if the first randomly selected person is male and the second randomly selected person is also male, they alternate to make sure that it's male, female, male, female, male, female. So that's why you see the 50-50 split in terms of respondents when it comes to the gender breakdown. And as you said, in the last census, I think the gender breakdown was maybe a 1.2% difference between male and female. So you're right, but it's 50-50 because of how the participants are randomly selected using the alternative approach as the respondents are selected. In terms of the urban-rural, also, in our last census, I believe the urban population was about 57%. 57, 58, I believe. And then the rural population was about 43. So again, you would see the 60-40 is close enough, but at least, yes, there's some variation. How we deal with all of that is that the data is weighted before it is reported. So the weighting of the data would correct for some of the quote unquote differences that Dr. Mahama is seeing and pointing out. So ultimately, it's the weighted information that is reported, so that even though in the general population you would see, let's say, slightly more urban dwellers than rural dwellers, once you weight the data in the survey respondents, it all shakes out very well.
Hello?
Yes, hello.
Yes, sir. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Great to have you.
turn?
Great to have you here. So before we
Yes.
get into the details of this particular report, like my colleague mentioned earlier, we've seen a couple of reports focusing on corruption quite recently. One on from the UNODC together with TRAJ and the Ghana Statistical Service, and another from Info Analytics, and they all seem to point in one direction. What does this mean for you, even as at this stage in our democracy and in the country's life, that there are still issues of corruption despite all the interventions that we've put in place to deal with the menace?
Well, let me say a word about the previous conversation between my two good friends, Dr. Mohammed and Dr. Sai. You see, there's something I call the politics of research reports in Ghana. If you've been in this business for as long as I think I've been in this country, anytime Afro-barometer, and for that matter, any research that focuses on governance in Ghana, anytime it comes out, you are going to see some kind of questions about the integrity of the methodology. It's been going on since the late 90s, through the 2000s, and we come back again. The issue is that Gallup pool in the youth, they can sample the population of 350 million with only 600, at times 1,400, and make some very important and substantive conclusions from such opinion polls. In the case of Afro-barometer, so far as I know, this is one of the most serious worldwide methodologies that they use, not in Ghana, across Africa, in Latin America, and elsewhere, Asia. So the challenge of the methodology by politicians when these reports come out is something that is not news at all to me. So that was just my point. Coming to your substantive question, the issue of corruption. I think what I learned from the recent report by the UNODC in partnership with the Ghana Statistical Services and the TRAJ and all, is that corruption, actually, I should say, is confirming what most of us should know already. And what we should know already is that corruption is endemic. It cuts across politicians, religious people, headmasters, vice chancellors, messengers, you name them. That is to say, bribe taking. If that is, So it is a systemic issue. That's why I think those of us interested in fighting this cancer, whilst we put pressure on our leadership to lead in the fight, we should also be aware that this cancer has eaten into the very fabric of the Ghanaian society. You see, and that is very scary. And I think leadership, we need a strong leadership that can set the example. First in the area of prevention, and then in the area of sanctions. I don't think a lot of Ghanaians see sanctions being imposed when somebody is allegedly corrupt, because the processes for investigations are never made public. And that's why the issue persists. So for me, these latest reports are strong indications of where we are in terms of our inability to effectively tackle corruption in our country.
All right. Now let's go into the fine details of the report. There's perceived corruption at the presidency and among MPs. So there's a comparative analysis from 2008 to 2022, and I hope that we'll be able to pull that up shortly. Perceived corruption at the presidency and among MPs. In 2008, 19% believed that the office of the president was corrupt, whilst 23% believed that the same for MPs. No, I'm talking about presidency and among MPs, not police, judges, and magistrates. Okay, so great, that's it. So from 2008 to 2014, you see an upward trend in the numbers, and then it decreases from 2014 to 2017, where 53% of the people believe that members of parliament and the office of the president was corrupt. It comes down 2017, there's a plateau from 2017 to 2019, you see a straight line there. Then there's an upward, a really sharp rise from 2019 to 2022, where 54% of respondents believe that the office of the president was corrupt, and 55% believed that members of parliament were corrupt. So here we are, like you've just stated earlier, corruption is endemic. But when you have people in authority putting in measures like the creation of the Office of the Special Prosecutor, and members of parliament formulating laws and drafting laws to deal with the canker, and yet the people perceive that these same people are this corrupt, then it shows that they don't even believe in the systems that the people are putting in place. Right?
Is it safe to me?
Yes,
okay.
To you, Prof.
All right, sure. First, there's a big difference between creating institutions or structures to fight corruption and the actual practice, enforcement those rules put in place. And I think in our country, there's a serious disconnect between institutions we have created to fight corruption and actually making sure corruption is checked, the enforcement. Look, the recent creation of the Office for Public Prosecutor, it came in addition to IOCO. IOCO has been here for many years, and that came in addition to the conventional structures like the NBI and other investigative bodies. STRAC has been there since the creation of this constitution. All these bodies have been around for 30 years, except with the exception of the latest Office of the Public Prosecutor. And it's not surprising that perhaps people's perceptions have dipped since the 2000s, because at least we know that between 2000 and 2008, certain prominent individuals were charged and they were tried, some were imprisoned. And that, I think, may have created a strong impression on Ghanaians that, in fact, something was being done at the time. You know, of course, if you look at the period 2009 to 2016, there too we saw some glimpses of that, because at least we remember a gentleman called Abu-Baidoo or something, who was imprisoned for some alleged corruption by his office and all. And if you look at the crescendo of public anxiety over allegations of corruption since 2017, and even before then, and the promises of the incoming government to deal aggressively with corruption, and for the past 6 years, we haven't seen a single conviction of alleged corruption by so many people that we hear about. Then people just begin to wonder whether these institutions we have created to fight corruption are really going to succeed. Until you're able to pin people and sanction them, people will not be impressed. So for me, as I said earlier, if you create 20,000 institutions and spend taxpayers' money to pay people with bodyguards and all, and they are not delivering, it becomes a waste of national resources. Corruption can be fought effectively when those who are supposed to have engaged in it are properly prosecuted, and then you see some convictions. Otherwise, it's mere talk.
It would be mere talk. Let me come to Dr. Kwapong on this bit as well, since we started off on the tangent of corruption. When you look at that latest report and the chart, so it basically shows that between 2008 and 2022, the office of the president and members of parliament have rubbed shoulders when it comes to the perception of corruption. When you look at the year 2008, you would see that it was 19% for the presidency, 23% for the MPs, 31% for the presidency, 33% for MPs in 2012. In 2014, it tapered off, so it was basically 53% apiece. Then you come to 2017, a bit of a decline for the presidency in terms of the perception of corruption, 31% to 35%. I think the biggest gap within the period. Then 33% for the presidency to 36% for MPs in 2019. But in 2022, we're almost back to 2014 figures. 54% in terms of the perception of corruption at the presidency, 55% in terms of perception of corruption when it comes to members of parliament. When you look at that trajectory and you put it side by side with what we are seeing now, when you go to page 36, in terms of the index, page 36, the index of corrupt institutions, you would notice that there's a bit of a pattern there. Over the years, yes, public institutions have been put forward as being very corrupt, but there's an interesting tale of the tape now. Apart from the Ghana Police Service and the latest UNODC report, like was mentioned, pointed to the fact that in one of the categories, it was the most corrupt. But when you come to the office of the presidency, you wouldn't usually, per reports, find it in second place. So back to that chart I mentioned and putting it side by side with this one, you would see that now the two contenders, members of parliament and the office of the presidency, are in pole position, second position and third position. What do you think has changed over time, Dr. Kwapong?
And especially for the presidency, because as I went through the report and the data yesterday, the perceptions of the presidency is even more worrying. Because if you have benefit of the historic data and you stretch it back to 2002, when the question was first posed about perceptions of corruption at the presidency, it was as low as 11%, believing that most or all of them were corrupt.
True.
It was that low, right? So if you look at the trajectory where it peaks, goes down a little bit, but now increases by that much in 2022, then you start wondering what is accounting for that. I believe that I think over the years, you tend to hear some of these allegations, stories reported in the media, not only now, happening, let's say, within the public services or within MMDAs, things like that, right? But every so often now, you either hear stories from the presidency or linked to the presidency or some association with the office. And remember, the question is also the presidency and officials working in his office. So it could be a story about a staffer. It could be a story about an appointee. And all of that circles back to the institution of the presidency. And so you start wondering what is happening that is causing this change in perception, particularly of the presidency, when there was a time where only as low as 11% perceived them to be corrupt, compared to now we are at almost 55. And that can't...
That doesn't mean the people are waking up? Are people waking up? Are people becoming more discerning to the realities?
Or maybe maybe people are waking up more, or perhaps now we are also shining a lot more light on the infractions of public officials at the presidency. I think it's a combination of factors, but it is quite a worrying trend, right? And even if you look at the top 5 institutions, if you put even the police service aside, your next 3, we are talking about key institutions that make democracy work: the presidency, parliament, judges and magistrates.
So basically,
And
the three arms of government, the executive,
precisely,
the legislature, the judiciary, all of them are second, third, and fourth.
And that can't be a good signal, right? And if you juxtapose that also against the level of trust we have in these three key institutions, I don't think it's a place we want to be, where citizens begin to perceive the critical institutions that make democracy work as both corrupt and untrustworthy.
Let me just follow up with this on Dr. Mahama. So you look at this trend, and how much of a concern is it for you? And since you speak, you are from the office of the Vice President, and of course, by extension, you would have reflections on what the President thinks about this. I'll start off with you on what this means to the presidency, coming in second in terms of the perception of corruption. Like Dr. Akakpo mentioned, it has moved from 11% just a few years ago to 55%. In fact, when you look at the table, those who say most or all of those at the presidency are corrupt are 55%. And those who say only some are corrupt, 40%. Put that together, that is a very damning cocktail. Your reaction, Dr. Mahama?
Thank you very much. I think that I just want to say that it is not fair and it's not quite proper for the discourse for someone like the stage of Professor Dua to suggest that once something is about government, you should not make a comment, or you should not try to explain, you should not critique. Government has the responsibility of also providing constructive criticisms to issues that come against them. I'm not sure if an issue comes against for institute and he feels stronger that, look, the processes involved were not fair, he will not come to explain or defend. So let's do away with this particular argument that when something is about government, we will always defend. Even in academia, look, you don't know people, you write paper, they critique your result. He will have done that severally as a professor. So this is not a business about government. When we through that argument that it's about government and government is always defending, it is not helping the discourse. Of course, if government has issues about methodology, it is only fair and proper for government to raise those issues. So that said, let me then come to the issue of corruption. Look, the results that has been put in that particular slide, if you look at the slide, it's not just the presidency. It is across the moral fiber of this particular society.
Dr. Mahama, so the point to be made, and pardon my interjection, the point to be made isn't that maybe it affects just the executive or the presidency. The point to be made is that over the years, there has been a trend, and now the office of the president, the seat of the CEO of the country, is basically knocking on the highest point when it comes to corruption. That must be a source of concern. That is what we are looking at. It's not about other institutions being here. In fact, when you look at previous reports, you would see that most of these institutions always are there in the first place. The Ghana Police Service, always in there. But the point to be made is that when you have the presidency in second position, that should be a problem.
Yeah, Ben, the fact is that we are discussing corruption. And the results there is not an interpretation to the fact that the presidency is the second most highly corrupt institution in this country. That's not the interpretation of that results. And with the greatest of respect, that particular point there, people are asked, in the presidency or the presidency, do you think most of them are corrupt, or you think some of them, just to paraphrase? And most of the respondents who answered to that question say that most or almost all of the people or are the people at the presidency are corrupt. And then another said that some. Come to the media. Almost 100% of the respondents think that the media, some of them are corrupt, or all of them are corrupt. That the same results is saying is
actually I am looking at so let's hold it there. Per that same page, okay? In fact, when you come to the media, it is practically the reverse. No, hold on. It's practically the reverse of what we would see for the Ghana Police Service and the likes of the presidency, because NGOs are the bottom in terms of the perception of corruption. Next after that is private media. Following that from the bottom is public media. We are talking about public media entities. And then, so you would see that NGOs, the perception of corruption, those who say most or all of them are corrupt, 22%. Those who say some are corrupt, 59%. When it comes to private media, which is where we're talking about, where we're having this conversation with you, 27% feel most or all are corrupt. 65% feel some are corrupt. And even when it comes to private media, mind you, there are political elements who own some outfits and all of that. So that has its own share of skewing of issues. Then there is public media. No, hold on. Let me just finish. Public media, 27%. Of course, that we do not fall into that category. And 65%. So I don't get the point you're trying to make.
The point I'm making is that the research we are reading to says that, look, the respondents think that the Ghana Police Service, either all of them or some of them are corrupt. That is what the report is saying. And then the report is also saying that at the presidency, almost all of them or some of them are corrupt. That's what the report is saying. And the report is saying that when it comes to the media, almost all of them or some of them are corrupt. This is the results. I'm not impugning.
But when you do the comparative, you cannot possibly compare 55% to 27%.
No, I'm coming. If you indulge me, I will explain. Again, the result is saying that, look, when we look at the most corrupt people, the percentage of almost all of them being corrupt or some of them being corrupt, the Ghana Police Service, the presidency, and then the media at the bottom. I mean, in that order. That is the focus, and that's why you are focused. And I'm saying that, look, when we have this discourse to discuss corruption, let us take the whole picture. Let us not skew it to having a... But I'll come to explain why I think...
How exactly is it being skewed?
Dr. Mahama, I mean, we don't want to enter the arena. Doc,
if you will give me, unless of course you don't want me to explain. I'm explaining a point, and you will do me a good favor if you allow me to explain.
Please go ahead.
I'm here to provide explanation. So it will not be good, I'm interjected. So when we look at the office of the president, the reason why office of the president and the police will always come first in any survey you do on opinion poll is because of the contact with the people. How many of the 2,400 respondents would have a contact with the journalists? How many of the 2,400 respondents would have a contact with the traditional ruler? How many of the 2,400 respondents would have a contact with the business executive? So when we look at the contact level, you realize that politicians always, almost all the time, have contact with the people, and the perception of corruption is likely to be very high.
Is it not also because maybe the people see what is happening, the people who may be responding here are the very people who may have benefited from this or that or an attempt to buy votes? Don't you think that could be the reason?
It points to the point of contact. It points to the point of contact. That's the point I'm making. So when we have this result, look, we need to interrogate the results thoroughly. And look, without contact, you cannot even be able to ascertain whether a person is corrupt or not. Or you cannot even be able to form an opinion about the person's corruptibility or the otherwise. So when we discuss this, let us put all those things into the basket and discuss them. Look, corruption is pervasive in this country. I am not holding brief for any executive. I'm not holding brief for any member of parliament or any judge or magistrate. What I'm just saying is that when we are presented with results to interrogate, let's look at the details of this particular report. Let us not be like, oh, this is an government trying to defend government corruption or other. That is not far from it. I would support any move to, and this government has done a lot in fighting corruption. And you put the question to Professor, and Professor made an excellent point that, look, it's one thing about putting measures and one thing about the measures working. And because there are human beings involved, we must always continue work to ensure that we rid this country out of corruption.
Right, Dr. Mahama, thanks for your submission. I just wanted to say there that when you say that, when you interpret that the media is almost all the media or all of them are corrupt, at least that's not what we are seeing here. The majority of the respondents say that the media, public and private, aren't corrupt. So it's the other way.
That's not what the result is saying. The result is saying that a majority of the respondents think that some members of the media are corrupt.
Yes.
While a small percentage think that all of them are corrupt.
Yes,
this is what
So
this is what the result is saying. So let us not read differently.
Right. Yeah. Let's come to the issue of fighting corruption. When it comes to what people think about government performance in fighting corruption, in 2017, 30% thought that it was fairly or very badly in terms of the performance, and 60% thought it was fairly or very well. Now, fast forward to 2022, and there's such a wide yawning gap. 85% believe that it is fairly / very badly, and 14% believe that it is fairly or very well. How does that come across to you, despite, let's focus on this government, creation of the Office of the Special Prosecutor, the president coming out to say that he wasn't going to entertain corruption in his government, and that if people were looking for a way to make money, it wasn't to work under him. Despite all of this, people still think that the president hasn't done well in fighting corruption.
Yeah, I think that overall, as I mentioned, when it comes to perception of corruption, I don't always see the perception come down. Since the 1990s or early 2000s, as mentioned, it's been difficult to find a trend where people think that, look, this country is not corrupt, the politicians are not corrupt. But that said, we have a situation where a government that has invested or increased the allocation of funding to SRAJ over 38% of funding. We have the Office of a Special Prosecutor Act 2019 that guaranteed beneficial ownership. We've also been able, the Witness Protection Bill has been passed, and all these particular measures still, Office of the Special Prosecutor you mentioned, you still have the perception of corruption going high for this particular country. We may have to ask ourselves, why is this so? Is it because there is now much, which I mentioned the other time at here on your show, on your medium, I mentioned that, look, there is so much, the media reportage on these particular issues has been very, very, very elaborate now as compared to the time before. Look, we used to live in this country in the 1990s or later. No one even get closer to a politician to even probably determine whether or not a politician could even influence or could even be corrupt. But now, the democracy we are practicing, and then the sunshine on information, the passage of the right to information bill by this particular government, all of which will contribute to people knowing that, look, there is a perception of corruption.
Sorry, Dr. Mahama, please permit me. This has to do specifically with fighting corruption. So when you say, for example, what the media reports, so if the media reported about an issue of corruption and then we find out that there's been some investigation and the presidency has made some adjustments for a certain office, sacked some officials, that, based on what you're saying, that may feed into the perception then that government is fighting corruption. So I'm just basing it on your analysis, and I'm saying that this time around it's not the mere perception of the existence of corruption. It is about what government is doing to fight it. And the people say that government has performed badly in that sector. I did a 2017 and 2022 analysis. In 2017, the people thought that government was doing well when it came to fighting corruption. More people thought government was doing well. But now, it's the opposite. More people believe that government is not doing a lot in fighting, not the existence of it, in fighting corruption. And I'm asking that this government has done, like I highlighted, the Office of the Special Prosecutor, you just mentioned allocation to SRAJ and all that. But still people believe that you aren't fighting corruption enough.
So that's the point I'm making. I say, despite all these interventions, yet people think that government is not doing enough to fight corruption. There may be other explanation. One, one's perception is ingrained, it's difficult to read. That's one. Two, people are not seeing the results of these particular measures. Maybe, just maybe, people are not seeing the results of these particular measures being put in place. Thirdly, people are not sometimes even aware of these particular measures being put in place. These are the factors that would explain why, despite the measures you yourself you've attested to, people still think the government is not doing well enough to fight corruption. Look, my problem with the issue of corruption, and if these are personal, these are not government, it's like the institutional framework, the democracy we have chosen for ourselves, has made it extremely difficult for us to fight corruption. To fight corruption, you must live within the law. The law is the creature of the same people it is supposed to govern. When that happens, and the president cannot just, even when someone is accused of corruption and it is not proven, it is not fair and proper for the president to sack that person, or to even, the president has not got prosecutor authority to, of course, through the Attorney General, the president prosecute, but the president cannot determine whether a person should be prosecuted or not, unless by the court or by the law. if there's no law governing it, or if the law is defective, or even if the evidence before the court does not suggest that, look, the person should be prosecuted, the person should be convicted of this particular crime, there's no way we can be able to convict that person. So we need to look at the whole regime. We have mentioned, the other time Ben was mentioning about South Korea and Malaysia and all those, the measures they took. Look, the measure they took, I'm not sure under this particular democracy, when we begin to take the same measure, the same media, of course, as a watchdog, we need to be concerned. The same media will come after the government. Look, they must be due process.
You cannot say that for sure. You
law.
say you are not sure. You cannot say that for sure.
That if the president, what you call, summarily dismiss someone without evidence, that if the person is being accused and the president sacked the person, you will not have concern about it. That the president will be following perception and be sacking people anyhow. You will not have.
I think there's more that goes beyond perception, and I can list for you a number of instances where people have been caught with their fingers in the cookie jar and they are still walking around. Let's not even go there, Dr. Mahama.
I'm saying that, look, when you have evidence, look, the law empowers even you, Ben, that if you have evidence that someone has been caught in the cookie jar, you go to the court, present your evidence, the person will be prosecuted. You go to the special prosecutor, the person will be prosecuted. The law empowers each
Yeah, that is true. The law also empowers us to get certain pieces of information. You know how difficult it is. The information minister has come out to say, oh yes, use the right to information law. Have you tried getting information from any of our public institutions before, Dr. Mahama?
I mean, I will not have difficulty having information from a public institution. But I'm saying that the law empowers us. Until recently, even the court has pronounced and has asked some people or some government agencies to provide information to certain media actors or certain activists. So the law is not supposed to be, as it were, to serve only the executive or serve only the legislature or serve only the judiciary, but the general public, the fourth estate of the realm.
Okay,
the law is supposed to serve it.
Just hold for me. I have a final bit for you, at least not to end the conversation, but before I move on to Prof, I just wanted to run this by you. When you go to page 45, since we're in the thick of corruption, there are some bullet points there. So perceptions of corruption among public officials and public institutions have increased compared to 2019. There are charts I don't want to go into now. Among key public officials, the police, the presidency, MPs, judges, and magistrates, more than 3/4, 77% of Ghanaians say the level of corruption in the country increased somewhat or a lot over the past year, a 24% jump compared to 2019. I don't know what accounted for that. Fewer than 1/3, that is 30% of Ghanaians, believe that people can report corruption without fear of retaliation. I'll get to that because there's an important point when it comes to the media and even safety in reporting corruption. Maybe Bernice will get into that. It's in the preceding pages. Of Ghanaians believing that people can report corruption without fear of retaliation, a decline by 4 percentage points compared to 2019. And we've also seen the impact of that in the Reporters Without Borders reports that have come our way. But I want to ask you, you say the presidency has shown great commitment to fighting corruption. I have 3 questions quickly for you. Very simple. 1, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate how efficient and effective the presidency has been in fighting corruption? 2, the president told us before assuming power that he would adopt the ANAS principle. Is he using that? And 3, there's this latest issue of the NDA and 10 million Ghana cedis. Is the president aware of this matter? We've still not heard from him.
From the very last, the special prosecutor has issued a statement.
I asked the categorical question, Dr. Mahama, respectfully. Is the president aware of it?
I'm saying that the presidency is aware, and the special prosecutor is aware, and that's the agency responsible for that. The president will not look. The statement has even become public. Even if the president was not aware, the special prosecutor investigation is a matter of public record. The president will be aware. He is the commander-in-chief. Every information on this particular country, the president should have the right. He should have even the first.
So as a doyen, as someone fighting corruption, the way you paint, the picture you paint, it's been how many weeks now since this information has been out? In fact, giving credence to it, just last week for Martin Kpebu to take on the presidency and say certain things that the presidency found unpleasant. But the president is aware, and as someone fighting corruption the way he is, he's not spoken to the issues up to now. You feel that is okay?
Look, the president, I disagree completely. If anyone asks the president to speak on any issue of corruption that comes up, their institution, the president set up the office of the special prosecutor to take up the burden of fighting corruption. The president doesn't need to come and be addressing the Ghanaian public anytime an issue of corruption arises. That's what the office of a special prosecutor is doing. And the president, the office is doing just like that. In fact, before Martin Kebo spoke, the office had invited people. I'm aware that the office of a special prosecutor had invited people, and they had some people to respond to certain questions. About 1 or 2 months ago, I'm privy to that particular information. The first time I heard of that information was when Martin Kebo also appeared on Dry News. The first time he talked with Samson, and he mentioned this thing. As at that time, the office of the special prosecutor had already taken steps. And if you read their statement, if you have read their statement, they would have told you the time they invited some of those particular people. So the president is aware of that. Two, the analysis principle that you said the president had mentioned that he was going to take. Look, personally, when analysis principle is being adopted, I have my fundamental issues with it. Not that I am a lover of corruption or look, I believe that people should not be entrapped. That is one thing. And when analysis principle is involved, there are this particular contention of whether or not. Look, why is it that the analysis principle has not been able to give us the result? Nyantechi was involved. He was acquitted. There are a lot of corruption activities that probably they are not reported, but they cannot be able to stand the rigors of the judicial process. So the president, being a lawyer himself, would have advised himself, look, some of these particular measures, if you do them, you cannot stand the test of time.
Are you suggesting that the president has shifted from will adopt the ANAS principle to now will adopt other principles apart from the ANAS principle? Just clarify.
The president had said that he was going to adopt the ANAS principle, but when he came to office, he has signaled to the country that I am introducing a bill to Parliament to form an office of the special prosecutor, and that office is supposed to prosecute. So he had already told you, he had already told the Ghanaian people what he intended to do. If the president was interested in recruiting investigators and letting them go into the offices and find out corruption, he would have communicated that to us. So the president setting up the office of the special prosecutor had already, it's a communication to us, up an issue that, look, this is what the president wants to go in the issue about fighting corruption.
Okay, so at least it's good you've clarified for us. The president has moved away from the ANAS principle. At least now we know. How would you score, just before Bernice comes in, because we have to get on to other matters, how would you score the presidency in terms of the fight against corruption on a scale of 1 to 10?
I think that the president, on a scale of 1 to 10, I would have given the president 8.
Did you say 8?
10. I'll give the president 8 of the 10. Look, the reason why I'm giving the president 8 is, look, if you ask me, how has this country fared in the fight against corruption? I'll say that this country has done maybe good or fairly good, 6, 5. I will say that. But if you ask of the president's effort in fighting corruption, I'll give the president 8. And the reason being, the president has done whatever is necessary. However, there are other institutions of government that are supposed to work. If they are not doing the work, if the law is defective, the parliament has to play its role. If judiciary is not proactive, judiciary has to play its role. So I don't want to blame the government, the president, if measures being taken are not necessarily working.
Okie doke. Bernice.
Right. Okay. So moving to another aspect of this conversation, let me start with you, Dr. Osai Kwapong. It has to do with the fear people have when it comes to reporting issues of corruption. So quickly, let me just bring what the findings are in that regard. Risk of retaliation of reporting corruption. In 2019, 34% of the respondents said they can report without fear. The number dips in 2022 to 30%. In 2019, 61% of respondents spoke about the fact that there's a risk of retaliation or other negative consequences when it came to reporting corruption. And in 2002, the number increased to 69%. Now, we've spoken a lot about institutions and the fact that these institutions have been put in place to tackle corruption. But when you have a situation where the police service, which is supposed to provide safety to Ghanaians, especially when it comes to issues where their lives are being threatened as a result of certain positive actions they've taken. Hello, Dr. Osai Kwapong?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, okay. I thought you were the one saying hello.
I can hear you, yes.
So when it comes to the police, that's supposed to protect people who feel their lives are being threatened, being at the top of the corruption perception ratings. What is your reading of the impact of this, especially in our fight against corruption? Because the police has been there for a very long time. And so you'd ask yourself, if people are scared to report, the police itself is corrupt. I come back to the question I asked, I think, Mr. Kpebu about a week ago. Will we ever get to the point where we feel like we are making some headway when it comes to the issue of corruption?
You're right. I think what more and more what you're seeing is that this is an extremely difficult fight, right? So whilst we believe that perceptions are high, we believe that our public institutions are corrupt, we also are afraid to report incidences of corruption for fear of retaliation. So then you say to yourself, how do you actually then fight corruption? One of the things that Dr. Mahama pointed to was the issue of due process. And I remember there was a time when the president was asked about how come that when someone is cited or alleged to have been involved in corruption, he appears not to have done anything about it, or doesn't appear to be doing anything about it. And he said something very instructive, which I share that sentiment, but I'll add a caveat to it. One of the things he said was, not until you are in a problem with the law, you would actually not appreciate due process, right? That when you get into trouble, that is when you would want all the legal protections afforded to you, the presumption of innocence, the right to counsel, etc., etc. I think what we tend to do in dealing and fighting with corruption is we treat it purely as a legal matter. So if I'm accused, if Dr. Mahama is accused, if you are accused, we subject it to strict legal proof and we want the legal process to deal with it. And of course, we know that legal processes are very long. But again, like the president said, when you are in trouble, that is when you appreciate due process. But there is also a political angle involved in the fight of corruption. And for me, public opinion in terms of how well a government is fighting corruption is one in how politically a government deals with some of these things. Because, I mean, how many ordinary citizens would follow a corruption procedure in the court on a daily basis, read updates about it and see what is happening, versus imagine the president, standing behind a podium, condemning an individual, but saying, I'm also going to refer you to the legal process. I hope they deal with you. Or, certain political signals like, look, I know you're presumed innocent until we can prove you guilty. But for the time being, you can't be part of my government until the legal system clears you. I think some of those things helps change the perception in the court of public opinion, because that is where you win and lose people. So if we always focus strictly on the legal structures in place to fight corruption and not pay attention to some of the political aspects of how you fight corruption, then you would always end up in a situation where citizens would keep questioning a particular government's commitment to fighting corruption. The other thing I think this report highlights, and I've been asking myself, is the perceptions were extremely positive in 2017. So the point of reflection for the current government is, what has happened between 2017 and 2022 when citizens believe that they were doing very well in the fight against corruption, the level of corruption had decreased somewhat and all of that. And all of a sudden, within a space of 5 years, when they are being asked these same questions, their perceptions of the government has changed. That for me is the worrying point and the point of reflection for the government to say, what is it that we are doing or not doing that all of a sudden is changing the way people perceive us and people feel about us on this matter of corruption. But ultimately, it also shows, as Dr. Mahama said, how endemic the situation is, and how the fight is extremely difficult. But again, if we are going to always leave it as a purely legal matter, then it would be very difficult to change some of those public perceptions. That there are certain things that I believe we can also do, wait as you wait for the full legal process to play out. I mean, what do you do, for example, with the Auditor General's report when it shows all of these infractions that are happening in the MMDAs? Unless you see certain moves, maybe like the actual surcharges, people actually being made to repay certain monies, paid without support of, receipts, things like that. I think some of those things, if we see a lot of that, may bring people's confidence back in our fight against corruption. The last thing I would say is, the other thing you would also notice in Afrobarometer is that in the first couple of rounds, when citizens were asked about the most important problem, for a while, corruption didn't even feature in the top 10, right? But now we are seeing corruption featuring in the top 5 as the most important problem to be dealt with by government. So it's quite complex, right? Now we recognize that we must do something about corruption. We are also afraid to report it because we fear retaliation, but our perceptions of public corruption is also growing. And it's a complex matter that needs to be carefully taken apart to see how best we can fight it, both politically, but also relying on the legal system to do justice with people caught in acts of corruption or alleged to have been caught in acts of corruption.
Dr. Akakpo, very quickly, it's just a follow-up on what Bernice said. So 2 quick points. When you look at page 9 and you look at those rejecting one-party rule, it stands at 89%. Those rejecting one-man rule, 88%. Those preferring democracy, 76%. An interesting dip. But when it comes to rejecting military rule, I just want to... There are some 33% people who are not feeding into this, rejecting military rule. 67% are for it. How about the 33% who are not? And that also brings me to how that could be shaping up against the approval rating of Mr. President. It has interestingly moved from 61% in 2019 to 30%, in fact, described as the worst performance of any president in 20 years. How do you react to that quickly? So
I will try not to make a connection between our rejection of authoritarian regimes and the president's approval rating. Yes, we still reject one party, one man. We've seen a bit of a dip in the extent to which we reject military rule, right? We are at almost 7 out of 10. But when you put it all together, I still believe that we are I'm still very convinced that our democracy is safe and we have made our peace with democracy, despite some of these challenges that we are facing. If you look at the president's approval rating, and again, it goes back to the question that I just asked, which is, why is it that for a president that was seen very positively and thought highly of in 2017, or even in the pre-election surveys in 2016, and even in the pre-election surveys in 2020, right? That what is it that is happening that is fueling this new perception about this presidency where trust has gone down, perceptions of corruption has gone up, approval rating has even dipped to the lowest that we've seen in the course of the Afrobarometer. And for me, that is really the point of reflection for the government and particularly the presidency, to begin to ask, why are citizens losing faith in us? And what is it that we can do to restore some of that really goodwill that we had in 2017 with the Ghanaian citizens?
Let me come to you, Professor Agyeman-Duah. So in that Afrobarometer report we are referencing today, we see the presidency, magistrates, MPs, some traditional leaders, even the media. It appears every sector of this nation is perceived to be corrupt. Where then do we start the transformation agenda from?
It's a very important, interesting question. And as my colleagues have been saying, fighting corruption is a very difficult task. How we begin this, we have to have a short-term, medium to long-term strategy. The short-term to medium-term will be a leadership that accepts itself in the fight and impress the people through practical actions in terms of vigorously pursuing corrupt people and trying them, putting them through the legal processes, and convicting them when they are in fact guilty. That is the way to impress the people that something is really happening. Now, I think that's happening. You look, I do agree with my friend Dr. Mahama earlier that we cannot expect the president to be accusing, alleging, and mentioning people and all that. We have institutions. But the way our centralized political system is, it's easy for all of us to quickly point to the president. After all, he's the CEO. So we are right in doing that. But what is an issue here is why the institutions specifically set up to fight corruption are not being proactive. When a case is reported, it takes years for the investigations to continue, and most of them just die in the process of the investigation. So what I'm suggesting is that in the short to medium term, certain practical actions, the president or the government, the institutions become more assertive and proactive in fighting it. For the longer term, this country needs a real transformation. And I go back to our school system, because our schools are not teaching our children ethics, civil responsibilities, and these kinds of values that we all need. What strikes me most about the current day, especially the report from the UN and the SRAG and the South Africa, clearly the whole country is rotting. And we can only transform it if we begin education, both informal and formal education structures. That will begin to impress on people our tasks and the responsibilities that each of us has in fighting. Because after all, people who get into government, including the president, are people from within us. They are Ghanaians. We live with them. So if we are rotten, as these reports are indicating, head teachers, police, judiciary, you name them, if they are all corrupt, then anybody who is elected into government will be corrupt. That's my point. So therefore, in the long term, we have to have a certain education, maybe re-educating ourselves and how we can behave towards it. So these are just my quick points on that.
Appreciate your time here, Professor Bafo Adjumandua is Chief Executive Officer of the John Kufuor Foundation. Benjamin.
Just to wrap the conversation with you, gentlemen, we've run out of time, but I'd like to find out from you, Prof. I know there's a gathering of young people, businesses in Kumasi coming up under the auspices of the Kufuor Foundation. What can you tell us about that briefly?
Oh, thank you. In fact, I'm in Kumasi for that purpose. For the first time, we are organizing what we call National Youth Agribusiness Festival, bringing together about 200 young entrepreneurs for 3 days to display their products, to build networks, and also to receive lectures on how they go about becoming successful entrepreneurs. It's our modest effort to really change this country around, because we believe strongly that the future belongs to the young people. And we have to let them begin to own it as they are going towards leadership. So this event in Kumasi is a 3-day event at the Temple Assembly Hall. Is as I said, these 200 young people are coming from all over the country to showcase their work and their products, engage each other, and there will be seminars in between. So we invited some very experienced entrepreneurs to come and share their experiences with these young people. That's what we are doing.
Well, we wish you all the best with that as you seek to change the face of the youth and entrepreneurship. But thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining the conversation. Dr. Kabiru Mahama from the Office of the Vice President. We had Dr. Osai Kwapong, who joined the conversation as well. and Professor Agyemang, CEO of the Kufuor Foundation. Bernice?
Yes, an interesting conversation it was, but we have to move on.
A bit feisty at some points.
Yes. But we have to move on, and this time round we'll be focusing on this seeming
simmering tension.
Simmering tension between the family of the late former president, John Evans Atta-Mills, and his former aide, Koku Anyidoho. We saw what played out over the weekend during his 10th anniversary. And I saw a post on Facebook. Someone was asking, is there not a leader? Is there not somebody who could step in and intervene? Why should
But the Abusiapeni himself, I mean, from the family, has spoken, and he's painted the picture of what they think. And the question, though, is if they go to court, and I don't know, the dynamics could play out there, but if the Atta-Mills Institute, Allah Koku Anyidoho, is told to step aside, I don't know what that would mean for his relevance in all of this.
Yeah, so we'll come back to have that conversation. Do stay with us. We'll be back shortly.